Senator Adam Schiff sat rigidly under the blinding, harsh illumination of the Senate Judiciary Committee's halogen lamps, blissfully ignorant that his 24-year political dynasty was mere seconds away from total annihilation. That morning, the mood locked within room 226 of the Dirksen Senate office building transcended mere tension. It was intensely predatory. The atmosphere felt suffocatingly dense, humming with the savage anticipation that serves as lifeblood for Washington insiders. On paper, this highly publicized event was sanitized with the bureaucratic label of accountability for misconduct in congressional intelligence oversight, a carefully crafted moniker meant to give the impression of a routine administrative duty. However, every veteran reporter holding a microphone, every exhausted political aide, and every lawmaker seated on the gleaming mahogany benches knew the deadly reality of the drama that was about to commence. Senator Adam Schiff, a newly elected Democratic senator from California who had recently concluded a ruthless 2-decade stint in the House, was on the verge of being crushed under the terrifying and inescapable gravity of speaking under oath. The focus was squarely aimed at the 7 relentless years he spent dominating American television networks, exhaustively trying to persuade the populace that the 45th president was a compromised secret asset for Russia. Seated at the witness desk, Schiff appeared deeply entrenched in his own legendary status. He was shielded by the impenetrable, tailored arrogance of an elite political survivor, a figure who had smoothly navigated the turbulent waters of 2 vicious impeachments, dismissed a humiliating formal censure from the House, and accumulated exactly 423 cable news interviews without once losing his practiced on-camera poise. He maintained the perfect statue-like bearing of an apex predator, completely certain of his intellectual superiority in any given setting. Historically speaking, securely cushioned within the Washington establishment's echo chamber, his confidence had always been validated. Yet, the current inquiry was not focused on Schiff's indisputable intellect. The horrifying question lingering in the climate-controlled chamber was how he had purposely and maliciously weaponized that intellect to devastate the lives of others. Commanding the chamber from the towering wooden dais was Vice President JD Vance, executing his constitutional duty as the President of the Senate. The visual contrast between the two figures was immediate and profound, as Vance's massive desk was starkly empty. It was completely devoid of the customary bright legal sticky notes, massive piles of classified files, or the theatrical visual aids usually favored in congressional hearings. Instead, a single plain manila folder sat perfectly centered on the polished wood before him, resting there like a chambered firearm. Within that deceivingly slender folder rested exactly 5 standard sheets of paper. At the very top of each page, typed in stark, uncompromising black ink, was a specific name. Before the vice president could even complete the standard parliamentary greetings, Schiff launched his trademark weaponized tactic, a measured, dominating interruption. His voice immediately reverberated across the cavernous room, projecting the rehearsed, rhythmic pacing of a former federal prosecutor who had never truly left the trial phase. It was a tone biologically built to establish the rules of engagement, radiating an implicit threat that he had been calling the shots in this legislative arena for more than 20 years. Staring up at Vance with a calculating gaze rather than a dismissive one, Schiff accurately judged that he was up against a younger rival he hadn't yet fully evaluated. Schiff's verbal delivery was a tool of absolute precision, sharpened over 24 years into a rhetorical device as accurate as a Swiss timepiece and as coldly strategic as a Swiss bank. He audaciously accused the vice president to his face and in front of the gathered press of organizing a politically driven vengeance campaign, flatly claiming the new administration had turned the Department of Justice into a weapon to relentlessly pursue its political adversaries. He referenced the public calls for investigations and the subsequent hesitation of career prosecutors in Maryland to indict him due to a lack of evidence, framing the whole hearing as an absurd theatrical performance. He launched a direct assault on the administration's disputed history of dismissing inspectors general and dismantling entrenched intelligence frameworks merely to enforce unquestioning loyalty. Leaning aggressively toward the microphone with his jaw clenched in pure defiance, he essentially told the vice president that Vance lacked the moral authority to school him on the nuances of political oversight. The gallery whispered, immediately swept up in the formidable pull of Schiff's undeniable rhetorical prowess. Perched above on the dais, Vance merely listened, taking in the toxic allegations without showing a single physical response. There was no narrowing of his eyes at the term revenge tour, no bristling at the stage manager insult, and no defensive reaction against the suggestion that he was just a loyalist pawn. Vance held the toughened, unbending composure of someone whose chaotic Midwestern upbringing had exposed him to explosive screaming matches, much more vicious and psychologically scarring than anything a refined California senator could muster beneath the safety of committee cameras. When the final reverberation of Schiff's opening attack dissolved into the room's tense silence, Vance systematically and agonizingly slowly flipped open the manila folder. He gazed down at the first document for a lengthy, excruciating moment before redirecting his steady, unflinching stare down to the witness table. When Vance eventually began to speak, his tone was deeply rooted in a level, unyielding Midwestern cadence, a voice purposefully stripped of all DC theatrics, one that never needed to increase in volume to establish total dominance. He dryly and almost clinically expressed gratitude to the senator for his opening remarks, pointing out with surgical exactness that his own grandmother used to yell at the TV and was much more persuasive, although he did respect the dramatic flair. A quiet, intensely anxious wave of laughter rippled across the gallery, but Vance's expression stayed rigidly set in stone. He immediately eliminated all expected political fighting grounds, systematically blocking any arguments about Russian collusion theories, the complex maze of FISA court warrants, or the impending federal probes into Schiff's personal mortgages in Maryland, pointedly leaving those complicated legal issues for the Director of National Intelligence and the Attorney General to unpack. Instead, Vance's gaze fixed upon the open file, his tone plunging into a register of immense seriousness that immediately changed the room's atmosphere. He declared that the exclusive focus of this gathering would be human beings, particular vulnerable individuals whose lives Schiff had intimately affected and permanently ruined. He wasn't there to debate heavily censored intelligence memos. He was there to force a harsh reckoning concerning the everyday citizens whose livelihoods were obliterated merely for prime-time cable ratings. These were the individuals who bore the catastrophic financial and societal burdens of Schiff's carefully managed narratives. Individuals who never got a single apology, and individuals whom the senator had surely erased from his mind the second the camera's red lights turned off. Vance flipped the first piece of paper and let the initial name fall into the oppressive quiet of room 226, like a massive stone sinking into dark depths. Carter Page. He read the man's background not with the usual malice of a political operative, but with the objective, unavoidable accuracy of a military attendance sheet, United States Naval Academy, class of 1993, a patriot who had honorably donned the nation's uniform as a Marine intelligence officer and who later worked lawfully and transparently within Moscow's intricate energy market with the complete awareness and sometimes cooperation of U.S. intelligence bureaus. Vance systematically took apart the dark legends, explaining how Page was merely a fringe, incredibly short-lived volunteer energy advisor during the chaotic 2016 Trump campaign. He was someone who sat in on just a few low-level gatherings, and penned a handful of harmless memos, utterly isolated from any core circle of executive influence. Yet, Vance pointed out, his eyes narrowing with a disciplined, freezing anger, Schiff had eagerly exploited his unmatched congressional megaphone to violently transform this military veteran into the most infamous accused Russian spy in contemporary American history. At the witness table, Schiff made a tiny adjustment, a barely noticeable shift in his posture that revealed the abrupt realization of a man who felt the strategic ground actively crumbling beneath his expensive shoes. Vance brutally hammered away with undeniable truths, reminding the quieted chamber how Schiff had fiercely championed the profoundly flawed FISA surveillance warrants on national TV, using the massive institutional weight of the House Intelligence Committee chairmanship to publicly legitimize a legally corrupted procedure. The vice president systematically turned to the next page, invoking the undeniable ghost of Inspector General Horowitz's damning report, which formally exposed 17 major disastrous mistakes and purposeful, malicious omissions inside those exact warrant requests. He purposefully wielded the name of Kevin Kleinsmith, the disgraced FBI lawyer who had pleaded guilty to intentionally modifying a federal email to falsely claim Carter Page was not an official CIA contact, a direct unlawful tampering of evidence used exclusively to illegally spy on an American. Vance's voice sliced through the air like a surgical blade, stressing that Carter Page, a citizen endlessly demonized across 423 separate television interviews by Schiff himself, had never been officially indicted for a single offense. No charges, no arrests, no court trials, zero guilty verdicts. Schiff leaned forcefully into his mic, his automatic, deeply ingrained defensive reflexes activating as he frantically tried to find procedural shelter. He stuttered slightly, an unusual event, desperately grasping at the technicality that the FISA procedures had been officially approved by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. It was a hollow pivot that was instantly neutralized by the terrifying truth that the court itself had been purposefully fed counterfeit evidence by the very institutions Schiff was unquestioningly defending. Vance did not raise his pitch or sharpen his inflection. His voice just moved forward, as unstoppable and inevitable as a river flowing around an obstinate boulder. He coldly questioned whether Schiff had even bothered to read the full 476-page Inspector General's document, causing Schiff's jaw to hang open in suspense for a painful half-second. It was the raw, terrified void between desperately hunting for a verbal defense and grasping with absolute certainty that no such defense existed. Vance didn't wait around for the vacuous reply, pivoting sharply back to the painful human truth, detailing how a decorated Naval Academy alumnus was now totally unemployable. Page's name had transformed into a severely toxic burden, completely radioactive, not just in a political context, but in a literal corporate hiring context. Following the massive Mueller investigation that formally absolved him of all doubt, Page had actively pursued jobs at 3 distinct elite energy consulting companies, only to be systematically and callously turned away by all of them. The denials did not stem from a lack of outstanding credentials or deep industry knowledge. They were entirely driven by the unavoidable, algorithm-driven trap of Google search outcomes. The top 40 results permanently linked his identity to a treasonous global plot he never took part in, a digital permanent scar created entirely by Schiff's unrestrained television rants. Vance shared the off-the-record admission of a frightened HR director who confessed they simply couldn't hire Page because their corporate partners would immediately see his name and connect him to Russian spying. The vice president let the dreadful weight of that truth sink deeply into the committee members. A private individual, completely devoid of the shielding armor of a government pension or a massive political campaign account, was forced to burn through hundreds of thousands of dollars of his personal wealth to legally restore a reputation that Schiff had gleefully ruined for free. Even though Mueller, Horowitz, and Durham had all definitively established his total innocence, Carter Page was still a phantom in the job market. Vance locked eyes with Schiff, charging the senator with throwing Page away the very instant the storyline fell apart, declining to issue a public retraction, neglecting to withdraw the catastrophic accusations, and quietly shoving the ruined life back into a shadowy box like a used prop from a completed magic trick. The crisp sound of the second page turning resonated loudly over the sensitive committee microphones as Vance moved his relentless attention to the next major victim of the narrative conflict, Lieutenant General Michael Flynn. Vance recited the impressive military resume with intentional, excruciating slowness, forcing everyone in the room to absorb the immense significance of a 33-year career in the U.S. Army. He pointed out the 5 grueling combat tours and the esteemed, highly classified period serving as the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency during the Obama years. Every word spoken stood for an exhausting year of unyielding sacrifice, a perilous international mission carried out perfectly and terrifying, life or death choices executed at 3 a.m. in secure facilities where one mistake meant American casualties coming home to Dover. Vance's usually monotone voice suddenly grew tight, his jaw noticeably clenching in a physical, clear display of profound personal anger. He brought up his own time serving as a Marine, passionately stating that every soldier, sailor, and Marine universally recognized Flynn not as a smooth political operative, but as an undeniable brother-in-arms, a committed, deadly warrior who fundamentally grasped that accurate intelligence directly resulted in saved lives on active, violent battlegrounds. Yet, Vance charged, his tone heavy with a restrained, intensely focused disdain. Schiff had opted to methodically destroy this decorated general's legacy on national broadcasting, strictly for the sake of cheap viewership. Schiff had carelessly and maliciously labeled him a compromised Russian operative well before any concrete evidence was collected, violently removing the sacred constitutional right to the presumption of innocence that Schiff, as an ex-federal prosecutor, had taken a solemn vow to defend. Schiff desperately thrust himself toward his microphone once more, trying to insert the cold, clinical legal defense that Flynn had initially pleaded guilty to deceiving the FBI. Vance easily and ruthlessly batted the interruption away, weaponizing the indisputable truth of the FBI's own handwritten internal memos, historical records that could not be retroactively invented or manipulated. He conclusively demonstrated that the actual agents who questioned Flynn did not think he was showing signs of deception. While Schiff frantically tried to revive the defense of the judicial process, clinging to the dry facts of the subsequent presidential pardon and the dropped legal proceedings, Vance relentlessly pulled the focus back to the raw, bleeding human tragedy that occurred before those intricate legal actions. The vice president illustrated a devastating, highly visual, emotionally overwhelming scene. A 3-star general, a man who gave over 3 decades of his life to protecting the nation, sitting utterly shattered at a generic closing table in Virginia, physically signing away the ownership of the beloved family residence where he had brought up his kids. Flynn was compelled to sell off his entire life's foundation merely to endure the crushing, apocalyptic wave of legal bills incurred specifically because a California representative had continuously labeled him a traitor to the country. Vance carefully outlined the complete disappearance of Flynn's hard-won retirement, the abrupt, cowardly cancellation of profitable corporate speaking events, and the tragic vanishing of lifelong companions who were completely terrified of the collateral damage of being associated with a man whose image CNN constantly aired next to the blinking red word compromised. It was not just the forfeiture of property, it was the complete systemic deletion of a life rightfully secured through 33 years of sacrifice and toil. And while this honored veteran was literally selling the house out from under his family to survive the attack, Vance observed with a voice full of total revulsion, Schiff was actively inventing reality. The vice president ruthlessly reminded the panel of the notorious September 2019 phone conversation between President Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky, recounting how Schiff had boldly and theatrically recited a totally fabricated, highly dramatized rendition of that transcript out loud during a televised congressional session. Schiff intentionally fabricated dialogue, changed crucial contexts, and purposefully inserted words that were never actually uttered, executing this under the solemn official authority of the Intelligence Committee he led. When finally trapped by the publication of the real, authenticated transcript, Schiff cowardly tried to dismiss the obvious fraud as a simple parody. Vance shook his head in slow, deep astonishment, pointing out the sickening, grotesque contrast. While General Flynn was auctioning his house to protect himself from Schiff's past fabrications, the chairman was already busy writing his next disastrous falsehood. Furthermore, Vance noted with a sharp edge, Schiff was presently facing an intense federal probe for supposedly committing his own fraudulent mortgage activities. The third page was flipped, and Vance's tone immediately softened, taking on a specific, highly protective tenderness strictly kept for those who are fundamentally too youthful and painfully innocent to warrant the crushing force of federal destruction. The name George Papadopoulos lingered in the dense atmosphere. He was just 28 years old in 2016. A kid, he was not an experienced spy chief, nor a hardened political operative, but a young man from Chicago, driven by a sincere, idealistic love for international relations and a real ambition to work in foreign policy. Vance explicitly told the toughened, cynical lawmakers in the chamber to clearly recall the precise sensation of being 28, an era characterized by the delicate, intact faith that following the rules and laboring diligently will organically result in success, a time of life existing right before the harsh awakening that a weaponized bureaucracy does not value fairness when it urgently needs a handy scapegoat. Vance turned his whole body toward Schiff, systematically tearing down the dark legends surrounding Papadopoulos. He removed the grandiose fantasies of espionage, making it clear that the young man was just a low-level, fringe advisor sitting in on routine campaign gatherings. The vice president then carefully presented the terrifying, extensively documented truth discovered by special counsel John Durham. It was the FBI, functioning on the absolute weakest and most pathetic of excuses, that had proactively used undercover informants to intentionally target, approach, and entrap the enthusiastic young aide. They actively dangled discussions regarding Russian dirt, artificially creating the exact illicit ties they were allegedly assigned to investigate. He emphasized the painful ridiculousness of Papadopoulos' final outcome, a catastrophic 12-day stay in federal lockup stemming entirely from a fundamentally trivial process violation. The young man had not falsely denied that a secret meeting took place. He had simply misremembered the precise chronological date of the meeting during a high-stress, frightening FBI surprise interview. Yet, Schiff shamelessly plastered this young man's identity all over national TV channels, breathlessly using a 28-year-old's genuine scheduling error as the definitive proof of a massive, sinister network of international Russian ties. Vance's voice oozed with raw, unfiltered disdain as he compared Papadopoulos' crushing vulnerability against Schiff's untouchable aristocratic privilege. The kid from Chicago had no multi-million-dollar legal defense chest, no entrenched political allies, and no unlimited funds approved by the California Democratic Party. He possessed nothing except his meager life savings, the frantic, terrified backing of his parents, and a ruined ambition of public service that Schiff easily transformed into a permanent mugshot without ever missing a fraction of a second of rest. Schiff, clearly shaken by the constant psychological barrage, frantically cleared his throat, trying to launch a feeble counterattack by arguing that the Durham probe had been heavily criticized by the people it investigated. Vance's reaction was immediate and surgically deadly, agreeing with a chilling smirk that found guilty criminals historically have a strong habit of fiercely criticizing the law enforcement probes that manage to catch them. The comeback hit with the physical impact of a slap to the face. Schiff's jaw noticeably clamped shut, not the measured, disciplined tightening of someone peacefully forming a rebuttal, but the panicked, defensive locking of a politician used to total conversational control abruptly, realizing that this particular narrative was expertly designed to completely defy his influence. Vance tossed aside the third page and slowly lifted the fourth. He gazed down at the document for an unusually long, heavy pause, the quiet dragging uncomfortably through the large room. When he had last spoke, his whole presence had altered. His voice did not get louder or lower in pitch. Rather, it slowed down significantly, taking on the frightening, careful pacing of a master surgeon, precisely choosing the exact instrument required to make the final lethal cut. Vance cautioned the room that he was going to present an individual they had absolutely never heard of, specifically noting he would avoid using her actual name out of deep respect for her enduring, intense fear of the federal authorities. The background noise in the hearing chamber vanished entirely. Carter Page, Michael Flynn, and George Papadopoulos were public figures, known entities trapped in the crossfire of political warfare. What Vance gripped in his hand was the heartbreaking tale of a private citizen who never wanted the limelight and had been completely destroyed by it. He introduced her merely as Jennifer. In 2018, she was a 31-year-old quietly performing routine data entry duties for a presidential campaign based in Ohio. For her work, she made a modest wage of $35,000 annually, an exact amount that mathematically permitted the leasing of a humble two-bedroom apartment and the means to feed one child. While describing her existence, Vance completely disregarded Schiff, purposefully fixing his intense gaze right onto the diverse group of committee members and their shocked assistants. The catastrophic triggering event Vance detailed happened in 2018 when the terrifying force of the federal government smashed into Jennifer's delicate life via a formal subpoena aggressively served by the special counsel's team. She had broken no laws. Her only unforgivable crime was that she had automatically processed one single email, hidden among tens of thousands, that coincidentally included a name that later showed up on a list, which was cited in a report that eventually acted as the core foundation for one of Senator Schiff's hyperventilating TV speeches. Vance stopped, letting the pure, repulsive absurdity of the scenario hang heavily in the room. A woman making $35,000 a year was pulled into federal crosshairs merely for typing a name she neither composed nor intellectually processed. Vance laid out the cruel math. A federal subpoena unequivocally requires the hiring of specialized legal representation, and those lawyers charge astronomical rates spanning anywhere from $400 to $800 per hour. Vance sternly ordered the room to calculate the math, compelling every elite lawmaker to physically sense the crushing burden of a $400 hourly fee crashing straight into a $35,000 yearly income. Jennifer was compelled to drain $22,000 to pay legal costs. It was the absolute entirety of her life savings. The financial safety net, crucial for the survival of the working class, was completely burned up merely to properly answer a weaponized document that eventually led to absolutely nothing. Vance's tone dropped into a level of deep, heartbreaking resonance. He explained how Jennifer's name predictably never appeared in the concluding pages of the Mueller document. She was completely discarded, much in the way a brutal, emotionless hurricane entirely forgets the individual homes it has smashed into pieces. Staring down at the plain white page, Vance detailed the devastating aftermath. Jennifer's 6-year-old boy had wandered into their small kitchen to discover his mother crying uncontrollably at the table. When the frightened kid inquired why she was weeping, Jennifer could only manage to gasp out the phrase, "work stuff." The vice president's words snapped like a whip through the quiet chamber as he challenged anyone to explain how a parent could possibly clarify to a first grader that their total financial stability had been instantly wiped out because a powerful, flawlessly dressed representative living 3,000 miles away in California had chosen to weave a fabricated story on television. You cannot articulate the weaponization of the judicial system to a 6-year-old. You just lie, dry the exhausted tears, and quietly get dinner ready. During this excruciating narrative, Adam Schiff did not interrupt once. His mouth stayed tightly closed. The experienced prosecutor was totally immobilized because there is no parliamentary trick that can defend against the pure, undiluted sorrow of a crying mother and her frightened child looking at an empty bank account. Vice President JD Vance methodically set the fourth page down against the polished mahogany, his fingers lingering on the edge of the paper before he slowly, deliberately lifted the fifth and final document. The atmosphere in the room shifted palpably. His expression twisted into a display of profound, overwhelming disappointment, an emotion that radiated a far more intimidating and chilling energy than mere political anger. He fixed his unyielding stare directly onto Adam Schiff and softly, yet clearly, declared that the final name printed on that page belonged to the senator himself. Schiff's eyes blinked rapidly in succession, marking the very first involuntary physical reaction the seasoned politician had displayed all morning. Vance did not hesitate. He initiated his final, devastating assault by surgically dissecting the deeply troubling company Schiff had chosen to keep. He dragged the dark, lingering specter of Democratic megadonor Ed Buck directly into the scorching, unforgiving spotlight of the congressional proceedings. Vance meticulously outlined the sickening and repulsive timeline. Buck had fiercely and aggressively pumped $2,700 into Schiff's political war chest. In return, the senator had gladly harbored that tainted cash throughout the horrific drug-induced overdose fatalities of 2 separate black men who had died inside Buck's notorious apartment. Even after Buck was officially found guilty and convicted of 9 severe felony charges, Schiff had stubbornly clung to the bloody contribution, only grudgingly issuing a refund when the escalating public relations nightmare finally mutated into an undeniable political vulnerability. Vance made it explicitly clear that this was not a simple bookkeeping error or an oversight. It was a ruthless, cold-blooded, and sociopathic calculation. Vance then mercilessly pivoted to the devastating heart of the financial contrasts at play. He violently juxtaposed the agonizing, heart-wrenching destiny of Carter Page, an innocent citizen compelled to sell his cherished home just to legally fight off entirely fabricated espionage accusations, with the shocking, explosive disclosure that Senator Adam Schiff was currently the primary target of an active criminal probe. The investigation was being led by the very same Department of Justice that Schiff publicly professed to champion the U.S. Attorney's office in Maryland had officially released criminal referrals alleging severe, systemic, and widespread claims of wire fraud, mail fraud, bank fraud, and the intentional forging of official financial documents. The federal probe had violently exposed Schiff's supposed doctoring of property filings to unlawfully obtain highly advantageous mortgage interest rates. He had shamelessly cited a lavish, sprawling estate in Potomac, Maryland, as his main residential home, while simultaneously claiming a condominium in Burbank, California, as his primary legal domicile. One innocent citizen was forced to auction his beloved house completely because of Schiff's televised falsehoods, while the senator himself was presently trapped under severe federal investigation for allegedly lying about the actual roofs over his own head. Vance relentlessly moved forward to the next brutal juxtaposition, heavily comparing the absolute catastrophic ruin of General Michael Flynn's 33-year military retirement against the sickening extravagance of Schiff's fully functioning multi-million-dollar legal defense account. Based on the most recent financial disclosure reports, Schiff was resting comfortably on a massive, untouchable $1.2 million war chest. Flynn, conversely, had zero political protection. He only possessed the inherent integrity he had bravely won in battle. Lastly, Vance dropped the heaviest hammer on the most heartbreaking comparison of all. Jennifer's wiped out $22,000 stacked up against Schiff's invincible empire. She had no secretive political action committees and no rich patrons handing over blank checks. She possessed nothing but a fast-draining checking account, a deeply frightened 6-year-old kid, and a lifetime of hard-earned savings that disappeared into thin air. Shutting the thin manila folder with a concluding firm snap, Vance shoved it aside and clasped his hands purposefully on the desk. He recapped the massive, sprawling destruction of Schiff's 7-year reign of terror. 423 television appearances had directly cost Carter Page's career, violently tore the House away from Michael Flynn, robbed 12 days of precious liberty from George Papadopoulos, and utterly destroyed the financial stability of a working-class mother in Ohio. And yet, Vance pointed out, his tone falling into a pitch of terrifying absolute zero, those very same fictional narratives had cost Adam Schiff absolutely nothing. The word nothing hovered in the oppressive air of the hearing chamber like a massive, unavoidable judicial sentence. Vice President JD Vance slowly rolled his heavy leather chair backward and stood up to his full height. It was not the hostile, commanding pose of a seasoned politician executing a calculated, strategic power play. Rather, it was the burdensome, weary posture of a man standing up simply because the physical action of rising infused the concluding moment with the essential, undeniable seriousness it demanded. He locked his unblinking eyes with Schiff across the 12-foot gap dividing the imposing dais from the solitary witness desk. Vance announced to the silent room that he had one concluding, singular question left to ask. It was an inquiry completely empty of intricate legal structuring, FISA procedural details, or complex campaign finance laws. It was a deeply, ruthlessly, and fundamentally human question. Have you ever apologized to Carter Page? The quiet that immediately blanketed the expansive room was total, absolute, and deeply frightening. 1 second passed, 2 seconds ticked by. The thick mahogany walls of the Dirksen Senate office building felt as though they were physically closing in on the occupants. Have you ever called Michael Flynn? Vance urged, his flat tone completely unflinching. The man who sold his house because of your television appearances and said, "I'm sorry I called you a Russian agent before the evidence was in?" 3 seconds, 4 seconds. The frantic, mechanical clicking of press camera shutters served as the lone, rhythmic heartbeat in the entirely frozen room. Have you ever contacted George Papadopoulos, who was 28 years old, who had a dream about working in government, whose name you used as a talking point on CNN, and said, "I'm sorry"? 5 seconds, 6 seconds. The mounting suspense was overwhelming, dense enough to physically choke on. Have you ever thought about Jennifer? Vance's voice had now sunk to a faintly audible, emotional whisper, forcing the highly sensitive committee microphones to struggle to pick up the raw, unfiltered feeling that his vocal cords could barely carry. He broadened the devastating inquiry to include the unseen, forgotten legion of collateral victims, the numerous data entry clerks, the eager weekend campaign helpers, and the low-level employees who had violently bled out their life savings because Schiff's televised illusions had magically transformed their normal, everyday occupations into horrifying federal probes. Have you ever thought about them at all? 7 seconds. 8, 9, 10. Adam Schiff stayed completely paralyzed at the witness table. His hands were laid flawlessly flat on the shiny wooden surface, the defensive, frantic pose of someone who suddenly had absolutely nothing left to physically grasp onto. His back remained perfectly erect, rigorously conditioned by 24 years of brutal, unyielding congressional warfare to never physically collapse under extreme public stress. Yet, it was exactly that stiff, statue-like flawlessness that acted as his definitive, undeniable tell. When a person is truly at ease, they unconsciously adjust their stance, fix their attire, or naturally shift their hands. Schiff was absolutely frozen, maintaining the terrifying immobility of a cornered beast, keenly aware that any tiny physical gesture would immediately be interpreted as a disastrous confession of deep, unmanageable guilt. His mouth was locked, completely closed, not the strategic, calculating silence of an expert debater holding out for the perfect second to launch a counterattack, but the crippling, suffocating seal of a man who had finally been met with a question that his elite Stanford law education and his hundreds of hours of cable television supremacy had totally failed to equip him to address. Right behind Schiff, his top legislative aide was fiercely staring down at her own shaking hands. She would not look up at Vance, and she absolutely refused to gaze at the back of her employer's head. The indisputable reality was that the brilliant, untouchable Adam Schiff was basically incapable of responding to a simple moral query that a little kid could easily understand. It was a binary question of fundamental human compassion. Have you ever apologized? The truthful, catastrophic answer, the answer that every lone senator, reporter, and millions of citizens viewing from home already felt in their guts, was a resounding no. He had never offered a single apology to anyone for anything over his whole 24-year tenure. The physical execution of verbally confessing that horrific absence of empathy out loud during a sworn Senate session while looking straight into the eyes of a vice president who had just brought back the ghosts of the lives he had shattered was a mental obstacle that Adam Schiff's highly calibrated machinery just could not break through. 11 seconds, 12 seconds. Vance slowly, solemnly nodded his head. It was the conclusive, grave nod of someone who had successfully pulled his answer, completely grasping that the deafening, cowardly silence radiating from the witness desk was endlessly louder and much more condemning than any refined falsehood Schiff could have ever uttered. "I didn't think so," Vance remarked, his tone totally flat. Pointing one final time at the slender manila folder holding the 5 shattered lives, Vance struck the lethal blow. The stories were free for you, Senator. They cost everyone else everything. With a forceful, massive swing, Vance slammed the wooden gavel down, throwing the hearing into an instant, permanent recess. In the deep, heavy quiet that lingered unnaturally long following the sharp smack of the wood, Adam Schiff stayed completely motionless, his hands stuck flat against the desk, his mouth locked shut. He was the frozen statue of a man who had dedicated 24 years to weaponizing spoken language, finally paralyzed by the single question that speaking could never, ever fix. When the digital dam inevitably broke, the viral explosion did not adhere to the conventional, expected boundaries of modern political journalism. The video clip that completely shattered cultural awareness belonged solely and exclusively to Jennifer. It was a haunting, devastating 44-second visual of a 6-year-old child asking his mother why she was weeping at their kitchen table. Capturing raw, unadulterated human devastation in just 22 spoken words, the video completely bypassed partisan algorithms and amassed an unbelievable 47 million views in under 3 days. It was fiercely shared by exhausted single mothers, panicked parents, and ordinary citizens who viscerally understood the life-altering horror of instantly losing $22,000 to the federal legal system. A secondary viral shockwave quickly materialized around the grotesque financial double standard. An anonymous user created a devastating split-screen graphic contrasting General Flynn's recently sold modest Virginia home with Schiff's sprawling, luxurious Potomac estate. The caption was lethally straightforward. One man sold his home to pay for a crime he didn't commit, while the other was actively under investigation for lying about his. This image detonated online, shared 2.4 million times in mere hours. Vance's chilling inquiry also sparked the number hashtag, an unstoppable grassroots cultural movement that dominated Twitter for 48 hours. Citizens began aggressively filming their local politicians, demanding moral accountability. Simultaneously, the California Republican Party unleashed a statewide mailer contrasting Schiff's $1.8 million legal war chest against Carter Page's lost home, just as Page formally announced a massive civil defamation lawsuit. Miles away, secluded on the third floor of the Hart Senate office building, 27-year-old legislative staffer Dorothy Chen sat completely paralyzed at her tiny, messy desk. She was an unseen, fatigued gear in the massive legislative apparatus. Earning precisely $52,000 a year, Dorothy frantically scanned her mental finances and realized she absolutely did not possess $22,000 to sacrifice to a lawyer just to avoid federal prison. Staring at the screen showing Schiff's agonizing 12-second silence, she whispered, "That's what it looks like when the words run out." 1,000 miles away, 44-year-old Marcus Webb sat idling in his dusty Ford truck in a Columbus, Ohio parking lot. In 2016, Marcus had simply volunteered 2 weekends to pound Trump yard signs into frozen lawns. By 2018, he received a terrifying legal subpoena. A local attorney drafted a single dismissive reply and mercilessly billed Marcus $3,200. That bill completely incinerated Marcus's emergency fund, which he had painstakingly built over 6 years by saving $50 a paycheck. The committee never contacted him again. Marcus muttered to his devoted yellow Labrador, Biscuit, about the extortionate cost of participating in democracy. He had resumed saving $50 a paycheck, but it now felt like a terrifying perpetual tax required to maintain a microscopic sliver of armor against the weaponized paranoia of Washington. Senator Adam Schiff had arrogantly tried to brush off the inquiry as a partisan revenge tour, but Vice President JD Vance had coldly turned it into a devastating, unavoidable roster of the condemned Carter Page, never indicted, permanently unemployable. Michael Flynn, compelled to auction off his family residence. George Papadopoulos, forced to endure 12 painful days in federal lockup. Jennifer, compelled to burn $22,000 in overwhelming legal bills. And looming over the destruction sat Adam Schiff, proudly possessing a $1.2 million legal defense fund and zero ability to offer a single apology. As the cameras eventually ceased clicking and the mahogany room cleared out, leaving only the phantoms of the destroyed lives hovering above the shiny wood of the witness desk, the American populace was left gazing directly into the horrifying, unblinking stare of a political engine that consumes its own people without a second thought. The silence from Adam Schiff had ultimately provided the definitive answer, but the much more frightening, lingering truth still reverberating through the vacant corridors of Washington was merely this: who would the machine decide to obliterate next?